Once upon a time, a rich man whose first wife had died, leaving him with a daughter, married again. His second wife was beautiful, but very mean and selfish, and she could find no room in her heart for the child, only her own 2 daughters, who were very ugly. The rich man's daughter was made to scrub floors and wash dishes and rake out dirty fireplaces, and soon the stepmother's ugly daughters began to call the girl Cinderella. One day, the king gave a banquet for the rich people of the land, and an invitation went out to the rich man and his wife and daughters. The ugly sisters immediately began discussing what to wear, and poor Cinderella was made to stitch and sew until her fingers bled. No one had thought to ask Cinderella to the banquet, although the invitation included her, and the ugly sisters teased her cruelly about it. "Don't you like our beautiful dresses?" they taunted in chorus. Poor Cinderella was far too busy to even think of going to the banquet, and her own clothes were far too ragged and dirty to wear to such a grand ball. Cinderella worked and worked, and on the evening of the banquet she was very tired. Even at the very last minute, the ugly sisters teased their stepsister. Finally, Cinderella could stand no more, and she sat down in the kitchen and wept bitterly. As Cinderella sat weeping, a little fairy fluttered into the kitchen. "Would you like to go to the banquet?" asked the little fairy in the sweetest voice. Cinderella rubbed the tears from her eyes and looked at the tiny figure. Who are you?" asked Cinderella in astonishment. "I am your fairy godmother," said the little lady, "and I am here to grant you a wish." "Oh, truly, I should love to go to the banquet," said Cinderella, "but I have nothing but these rags to wear," and she sobbed bitterly. "Then you shall go to the banquet, and I shall see that you have the most beautiful dress to wear. Now, first of all, I want you to bring me a pumpkin from the kitchen garden," said the fairy godmother. Cinderella went into the garden and selected the biggest and best pumpkin she could find, and Cinderella carried it into the kitchen and placed it on the table. The fairy godmother fluttered around the pumpkin for a second and then drew out a magic wand from her pocket. "First, my dear, you must have a carriage to travel to the palace in," said the fairy godmother, as she gave the pumpkin a gentle tap with her wand. With a shower of tiny blue and green sparkles that glistened like stardust, the pumpkin suddenly turned into a magnificent golden coach. "There," said the fairy godmother, "but next we must have horses to draw the coach. Bring me 4 mice from the pantry," said the fairy to Cinderella. Cinderella walked across the pantry and looked behind the flour sacks, and sure enough, there were 4 tiny mice nibbling away at the sacks. Cinderella shooed the tiny creatures into the kitchen, and the fairy godmother touched each one lightly with her magic wand. As the wand touched each mouse, it turned into a handsome white horse. "Now we have a carriage and horses," said the fairy godmother. "But the time has come to give you a dress so fine that all the handsome young men in the kingdom will fall at your feet." Waving her wand again, the fairy godmother conjured up the most beautiful golden gown that Cinderella had ever seen, and a pair of glass slippers. "Oh, it's beautiful," said Cinderella, and put on the golden dress and the delicate glass slippers. "Oh, dearie me, I'd quite forgotten," said the fairy godmother. "We need a coachman." "Oh, silly me, I'll forget my wand one day." A moth bobbed and flickered its way across the kitchen window, and the fairy godmother fluttered up to it and gave it a tap with her wand. And there, by the coach, stood a handsome figure in scarlet uniform. "There we are, my dear. Now off to the ball with you," said the fairy godmother. "Oh, dearie me, I've forgotten something else. My spells will last only until midnight, and then the coach will become a pumpkin again, the horses will turn back into mice, your beautiful dress will be replaced by tattered rags, and the coachman will change back into a moth. So be sure to arrive home by midnight, Cinderella." When Cinderella arrived at the banquet, every guest turned to stare at the beautiful girl. The king took Cinderella by the hand and introduced her to the guests, and then to his son, the prince. The prince was so amazed by Cinderella's great beauty that he immediately asked her to dance.
"You are the most beautiful girl I've ever seen,"
said the prince to Cinderella as they danced across the floor. Cinderella's two ugly sisters glowered with jealousy as the couple glided by. Suddenly the palace clock began to chime the midnight hour, and Cinderella broke away from the prince and hurried through the banqueting hall and out into the night. At the very last stroke of midnight, the beautiful coach changed back into a pumpkin, the horses became mice once again, and the dress was replaced by tattered rags, and the coachman turned into a moth. Feeling very sad, Cinderella ran away from the palace, and as she ran, her glass slippers fell off. One of them lay shattered by the palace steps, but the other slipper was found by a servant, who carried it into the palace and gave it to the prince. The prince had been so amazed at Cinderella's beauty that he stared at the glass slipper and vowed to find the girl who had worn it. He asked the palace footman if they had seen a beautiful girl leaving the banquet, but they could only remember seeing a poor servant girl dressed in tattered rags leaving the palace grounds. For many weeks the prince searched for Cinderella, but without success. Then an idea came to him. He would send out a proclamation inviting all the young ladies who attended the banquet to try on the glass slipper. The girl whose foot fitted the slipper would become his bride. The slipper was taken across the length and breadth of the kingdom by the prince's footman, and after many days they came to Cinderella's house. The ugly sisters nearly fell over themselves trying to squeeze the slipper on, but it simply would not fit. Just as the footmen were about to leave, one of them spied Cinderella and asked her to try on the glass slipper. She can't, cried the two ugly sisters angrily. How could such a scruffily dressed girl as this ever attend a banquet, they demanded of the footman. But we have been instructed to try the feet of ladies in every household that received an invitation to the banquet, said the footman impatiently. And so Cinderella tried on the glass slipper, and of course it fitted her slender foot perfectly, and the footman took her back to meet the prince. The ugly sisters were quite horrified, but there was nothing at all they could do about it. When the prince saw Cinderella, he was very surprised, but underneath the dirt and the tattered clothes she wore, he recognized the girl he had danced with at the banquet. Within a few days, Cinderella and the prince were married, and they lived happily ever after.
Deep in the heart of a great forest, almost 200 years ago, lived a woodcutter with his wife and 3 sons. The 2 eldest sons were big and strong, and they too were woodcutters. The youngest son, Tom, was weak and almost too small to hold an axe, and while his father and 2 elder brothers cut down the trees from morning until night, Tom remained at home. One cold winter's morning, the woodcutter fell ill, and he was unable to go into the woods to cut trees. The eldest son, seeing how ill his father was, offered to work twice as hard, so that they would have enough wood to sell. The woodcutter's wife baked a potato pie for the eldest son to take with him, and off he went into the forest with a pie in one hand and a huge axe in the other. The eldest son sat down on a log and ate half the potato pie, and then he began to chop down a tree. After a long morning's work, the eldest son grew hungry again, and he sat down to eat the remaining half of the pie. Just as he opened his mouth to bite from the pie, a little man popped out from behind a gnarled old oak tree and begged the eldest son for a piece of potato pie. "Be off with you," said the eldest son angrily. "If I share my pie with you, I shall not have enough for myself." The little man looked very sad and hurried off into the forest. The eldest son finished the potato pie without giving the little man another thought, and he picked up his axe and began to cut down another tree. But at the first stroke of the axe, the eldest son slipped, and the sharp blade glanced off the tree and bit into his leg, causing a bad wound. The eldest son limped home to have his leg bound. The woodcutter was no better on the second day, and his eldest son lay in bed with a bandaged leg. The second eldest son, seeing the plight of his father and brother, offered to do 3 times the amount of work, and his mother baked a big meat pie for him to take into the forest. Off went the second son with the meat pie in one hand and a huge axe in the other. Before cutting down the tree, the second son took out the meat pie and settled down to eat a portion of it before commencing woodcutting. Just as he was about to take a bite, the little man popped out from behind the gnarled old oak tree and said, "Please share your pie with me, for I'm so hungry." "Ah!" exclaimed the second son, staring down angrily at the little man. "Share my pie with you? I should think not. I'm a woodcutter, and I need every last crumb of this pie before I begin to cut the trees. Now away with you." Tears formed in the little man's eye, and he hurried away into the woods. Placing the remainder of the pie in his smock, the second son picked up the axe and swung it at the tall elm tree. No sooner had the blade struck the bark of the tree than it glanced off and cut the second son's leg. Tearing off a piece from the bottom of his smock, the second son bound the wound and limped off home. On the third day, Tom, the weakest of the woodcutter's 3 sons, was troubled by the plight of his father and 2 brothers, and offered to cut trees in the forest. "I know I'm only small, father, but perhaps the few twigs I could cut with a small axe would fetch a few coins to buy food with," said Tom eagerly. "Ha ha ha!" roared the woodcutter. "I don't think you could carry an axe, Tom, let alone cut a tree with it," laughed his father. Nevertheless, Tom pleaded with his father to allow him to work in the woods, and at last the woodcutter agreed. But there was no pie for poor Tom, just a crust of bread and a leather flask of water. He was also given the oldest, rustiest axe to take into the forest. Tom wandered off into the forest and sat down on a log to eat his crust of bread before starting the day's work. No sooner had he popped the first piece of bread into his mouth than the little man appeared from behind the gnarled old oak tree. "Please let me have a bite to eat," asked the little man in a sad voice. "Why, of course," said Tom, who, unlike his elder brothers, was a kindly, thoughtful lad. "I have only a crust of stale bread and a flask of water, but I'll gladly share it with you." The little man sprung onto the log on which Tom was sitting and touched the bread with his long fingers. Suddenly, the bread vanished, and in its place sat a beautiful brown pie. The little man then touched the water flask in the same manner, and instantly became a jug of burgundy wine. Tom looked in absolute wonder at what had taken place, and the little man looked up at him with a merry twinkle in his eye and chuckled. "There," said the little man, "now we can both eat and drink, and I shall repay you for your kindness." The pie eaten and the wine jug lying empty, the little man led Tom to the gnarled old oak tree. "You must cut down this old tree," he said to Tom, "and there, beneath its ancient roots, you'll find a token of my thanks." The little man then ran off into the forest, leaving Tom feeling slightly bewildered. Tom did as the little man had suggested, and, with magical strength, cut down the old oak tree. And to his amazement, there, amid the tangled cluster of roots, sat a goose. It was no ordinary goose, however, for its feathers were of pure gold, and they shone brightly in the sunlight. "I shall take the goose to the market, and I'll sell it," he muttered to himself. Before Tom could journey home through the forest, night fell, and he stopped at a small inn. Putting the goose in the stable for the night, Tom crept around to the back door of the inn, and spent the night on a heap of flour sacks in the kitchen. Next day, bright and early, Tom crept quietly out of the kitchen and walked round to the barn to collect the goose. As he was about to enter the barn, Tom spied the landlord's daughter plucking a feather from the goose's tail.
"What a beautiful golden goose,"
She said.
"I must have a feather to wear in my hat."
Once the landlord's daughter had touched the goose's tail, she found that her hand was stuck fast. No matter what she did, the girl could not free her hand, and she began to cry. Hearing the weeping, the girl's sister came running into the barn. But when she saw the golden goose, she too reached out to pluck a feather from its tail. She also became stuck, and after a few minutes, in came the landlord himself to see what all the fuss was about. Being a greedy man, the landlord wanted a feather from the golden goose's tail. But no sooner had he reached out to push his two daughters aside than he became stuck. By this time, Tom had become rather impatient, and, wishing to get to the market early, he took the golden goose and tucked it under his arm. But there, still stuck fast to its tail, were the landlord and his two daughters. Off they tramped through the lanes and across the fields until a parson spied them. "Stop!" he cried. "How dare you chase that poor young man?" The parson reached out for the landlord's coat, and, would you believe it, he became stuck fast. So it went on until Tom, with the goose, still tucked under his arm, led the landlord, two daughters, a parson, a postman, a coachman, a milkmaid, and a spinster across the fields and down the dales. Tom's path to the market took him past the king's palace, and in the garden stood a young princess who had never been known to smile. For many, many years the king had tried to bring a smile to the face of the princess, but he could not succeed. However, the minute the princess set eyes on Tom and his goose, with the landlord, two daughters, a parson, a postman, a coachman, and a milkmaid, and a spinster, all stuck fast to each other, she began to laugh and laugh and laugh. The king, seeing his daughter so happy, ran out of the palace and after Tom. "Young man," he called, "come back here this instant." Tom, upon hearing such a noble voice, stopped, and so did the landlord, two daughters, a parson, a postman, a coachman, a milkmaid, and a spinster, and they all fell in a great tangle on the ground. Seeing this, the princess laughed even more, and Tom, turning round and casting his eyes on her for the first time, fell in love. The princess looked at Tom's jolly face, and she too fell in love. And, at that moment, the magic that held everyone together disappeared, and their hands became free. The king looked at Tom and said, "You have made my daughter so happy that I shall give you permission to marry her within the week." Tom and the princess were married, and they went to live in the king's fine palace. And the golden goose was placed in a marble pond, where it swam happily amid the water lilies and duckweeds. The little man in the forest had truly repaid Tom's kindness.
His coat so gay, do you ken John Peel at the break of day? Do you ken John Peel when he's far, far away, with his hounds and his horn in the morning? For the sound of his horn brought me from my bed, and the cry of his hounds which he oft times led. Peel's new halloo would waken the dead, all the frost from his lair in the morning.
A long time ago, a young couple lived in a house that was close to the castle of a witch. From a top window the wife could look down into the witch's garden, which was always filled with flowers and herbs with strange-sounding names. No one dared to go into this garden, least of all the husband and wife, for the evil nature of the old witch was very well known. However, one day the wife fell ill. The only thing she asked for was a salad made from the roots of a purple flowering herb that grew in the witch's garden. "I dare not go there," her young husband told her. "What if the witch should catch me?" His wife became steadily worse, and at last her devoted husband scaled the high wall that surrounded the witch's garden and picked some of the herbs. Then he made a salad for his ailing wife. After she had eaten it, his wife declared that already she felt much better, but that she would surely die if he could not bring her more of the life-giving herbs. Hoping that his second raid on the witch's garden would again be successful, the husband agreed, but this time the witch was waiting for him.
"You dare to steal my precious plants! For that I lay my curse on you both!"
"My wife is sick," answered the poor man, white with fear. "She will die if she does not have some of that purple herb that grows in your garden. Forgive me and let me go."
Only on one condition. When your wife has her firstborn, you must give it to me. I will care for the child as if it were my own.
So anxious was he to be away that the husband agreed. The witch permitted him to pluck an armful of the flower, which she called Rapunzel. After his wife had recovered, the husband told her of the witch's threat, and she exclaimed, "What would an old witch want with a child? Let us forget it, husband, and be happy, for I have a feeling that we shall have a baby of our own before the year is out." Her forecast came true. A lovely baby daughter was born to them before the year was out. Alas, before the baby was 1 day old, the witch appeared. She scooped up the child in her arms and vanished. The witch called the child Rapunzel, after the name of the herb, and when she was 12 years old, shut her up in a high tower. Even at 12, Rapunzel was beautiful, and her long hair, which was fine as spun silk, was of great length. The only human being she ever saw was the old witch, whom she addressed as Dame and learned to trust. As there was neither door nor stairway inside the tower, whenever the witch came to visit Rapunzel, she cried,
"Rapunzel! Rapunzel! Let down your hair!"
Rapunzel then ran to the window and let down her long hair. It swung like a golden rope, and the witch grasped it and climbed upwards. After several years, it chanced one day that the prince of a neighbouring kingdom came riding past the tower, from which came the most beautiful singing he had ever heard in his life. Overwhelmed by curiosity, he stayed within earshot of the tower, until presently along came the witch.
"Rapunzel! Rapunzel! Let down your hair!"
called out the witch, and down came the golden rope of hair, and up climbed the witch. The young prince decided to try his fortune, and the next night, when it was dark, he stood underneath the turret window and called out, "Rapunzel, Rapunzel, let down your hair." At once the golden rope of hair swung down from the window, and grasping it, the prince climbed upwards. As soon as he was in the room facing Rapunzel, he grasped aloud at her beauty, and the girl was equally attracted to such a handsome young man, the first she had ever seen. "I cannot leave you here," cried the prince. "And yet you must," said Rapunzel, "for there is no way in or out of this tower except by my hair." "Then I will come to you each night after the witch has made her visit," said the prince, "and we can work out a plan." But Rapunzel had already thought of one. "Bring with you a skein of silk," she said. "Do likewise with every visit you make, and I will weave a rope of silk, and when it is long enough, it shall be my escape ladder. Then you must take me on your horse far away from this place." Everything went well. The young prince made his visit to the tower each night, bringing with him a skein of silk. When he had gone, Rapunzel set to work on her silken ladder. The witch, who made her visits to the tower in the afternoons, suspected nothing, until one day Rapunzel blurted out, "Tell me, good dame, why do I take twice as long to pull you up as I do my prince? You must be much, much heavier." At these words, the witch flew into a dreadful rage.
Ah, you wicked girl!
She cried, and taking her scissors, she snipped off Rapunzel's long golden hair. Then she cast a spell over Rapunzel so that she fell asleep. And when she awoke, she found herself in the middle of a desert. The witch settled down to wait for the prince, but first she fastened Rapunzel's long braids of golden hair to the window hooks. "Rapunzel, Rapunzel, let down your hair," the prince called out as usual when he came to the tower. And the witch threw down the golden braids. Up he climbed and came face to face with the spiteful, angry witch.
Your little bird has flown. You will never see her again.
In his shocked despair, the young man hurled himself out of the window and landed many feet below, on a bramble bush, whose cruel thorns blinded him. Unable to return to his own kingdom, the unhappy prince wandered through the countryside for many years. One day he came to the very desert where Rapunzel had made a home for herself. On seeing him, she ran to him and threw her arms round his neck, while tears of love flowed down her cheeks. The proud prince bowed his head, and a tear splashed into his sightless eyes and made him see again. Supporting each other, they made their way out of the desert. The prince took her to his father's palace, where they married and lived happily ever after.
King Cole was a merry old soul, and a merry old soul was he. He called for his piper, and he called for his bow, and he called for his fiddlers three. Now every fiddler had a very fine fiddle, and a very fine fiddle had he. There's none so rare as can compare with King Cole and his fiddlers three.
Once upon a time, there was a poor shoemaker and his wife. Although they both worked very, very hard, they got poorer and poorer as time went on, until one day he only had left enough leather to make one more pair of shoes. Before he went to bed that night, he cut out a pair of shoes. Leaving the leather on his work table, he went to bed. Sadly, he climbed the stairs and said to his wife, "Well, that's it. The last piece of leather cut out." The last pair of shoes were ready to be sewn. After that, well, they didn't know what they'd do. In the morning, the old shoemaker went to his work table. He couldn't believe his eyes, for there, on the table, was a perfectly stitched pair of shoes, made up from the leather that he'd cut out the night before. "Who could have done this?" he exclaimed. He rushed to show his wife. She didn't know who'd stitched the shoes either. That same morning, a beautiful lady came to buy a pair of shoes. The shoemaker showed her the pair that he'd found on his work table. "Oh, they're perfect," she said. And so they were. She was so pleased she gave the old shoemaker enough money to pay for 2 more pieces of leather. That evening he cut out 2 more pairs of shoes and again left them on the work table. In the morning he went to his work table, and lo and behold, he saw 2 perfectly stitched pairs of shoes sitting on the bench. Once again someone had neatly stitched the leather into 2 perfect pairs of shoes, which the old shoemaker sold to a well-dressed gentleman who called at the shop that very same morning. The shoes fitted the gentleman so perfectly that he paid the shoemaker twice the price for them. The shoemaker then bought 4 new pieces of leather, and that night he cut out 4 pairs of shoes. He left them as usual on his workbench, and in the morning, having risen early to make them up, they were already on his bench, neatly stitched. Night after night the old shoemaker cut out shoes and left them on the workbench, and each morning they were perfectly made up. Many rich people came to his shop and bought neatly stitched shoes. The shoemaker and his wife became very rich. One day, just before Christmas, the shoemaker and his wife decided it was time to try and discover who was stitching the perfect shoes. So they patiently sat in the shadows of the dark workroom and waited. Just about midnight, the door of the workroom opened, and 2 tiny, barefoot, shabbily dressed elves entered. The shoemaker and his wife, hidden in the corner of the room, watched while the 2 elves worked the pieces of leather into perfectly made shoes. When the elves had finished the shoes, they disappeared again. In the morning, the shoemaker and his wife decided that the only way to repay the elves for their kindness, which had brought them wealth and happiness, was to make them a beautiful set of new clothes and some perfectly stitched shoes. The old man patiently made up 2 tiny pairs of green shoes, and his wife stitched 2 shirts, 2 pairs of trousers, and 2 feathered caps for their tiny helpers. On Christmas Eve, their task complete, the shoemaker and his wife hid themselves in the corner of the workroom and waited. Just about midnight, the 2 elves appeared. They were blue with the cold. Jumping on the bench, they discovered not leather to be perfectly stitched into shoes, but instead 2 neatly stitched suits and 2 beautifully matching pairs of shoes. Well, you can imagine their surprise. How they laughed and danced as they put on their new clothes. Still smiling and laughing, they danced their way out of the shoemaker and his wife's lives, never to be seen by them again, leaving the couple to live happily ever after.